Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Sony FE 400-800mm F6.3-8 G OSS lens. Now, I bought the 200-600mm, this is the f5 to 6.3 G OSS, shortly after its release, and I've used it for the last 5 years. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that this has shown up in a number of different comparisons along the way. I've compared it to a lot of the third-party lenses that have come onto the market on FE, and generally I've come out thinking, you know what, I made the right choice in purchasing this. But what Sony has done now is basically take that same formula and expand it out all the way to 800 millimeters, basically shift everything about 200 millimeters forward. That makes it the first Sony zoom and probably the best zoom currently available to actually reach 800 millimeters. That also makes it bigger, heavier, and more expensive. So is it worth it? Well, that's what we're here to explore here today, which we'll jump into right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by the Fantom Tracker. Are you someone prone to misplacing your wallet or bag? If so, the Fantom Tracker card is definitely for you. This credit card-sized tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and functions like an Apple AirTag. It can be locally tracked via a 95 decibel beeping noise that can be heard up to 300 feet away, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My network and its map. Unlike many other trackers, the Fantom Tracker card has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge will last up to 6 months. The low price of the Fantom Tracker makes it a perfect gift, and you can save even more by visiting store.fantomwallet.com and using code DUSTIN20 at checkout. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off.
And I want to start by saying thank you to Sony for getting me loaners of these equipment and making sure that I have an opportunity to check out, critique, and sometimes praise their most recent offerings. Now, what's interesting is that although these two lenses have the same number of focal lengths available, they cover a range that covers basically 400 millimeters. But what's interesting is because of where they both start, the 200 to 600 millimeter has a 3 times zoom range, starts at 200 millimeters up to 600 millimeters, which if you do the math, that's 3 times. Well, ironically, if you move that starting position forward to 400 millimeters as we do here, even though it still covers 400 millimeters, it's only a 2 times zoom range. And so that looks like this. You can go from this framing at 400 millimeters to this. Now, like the 200 to 600, this is a variable aperture zoom. And so we start at f6.3, and so f6.3, that is from 400 to 482 millimeters. At 483 millimeters, it becomes f7.1 as the maximum aperture, all the way through 594 millimeters, and then from 595 millimeters, roughly 600 millimeters to 800 millimeters, you're going to end up with the maximum aperture of f8. Now, of course, variable zooms also means that the minimum aperture is going to scale in the same way. And so at 400 millimeters, minimum aperture is f36. At 800 millimeters, the minimum aperture is f45. Now again, like the 200 to 600 millimeter, it is compatible with their teleconverters. So that includes the 1.4 times, which I own and I have here, and then also the 2 times teleconverter. Now, I say that it's compatible. That comes with a little bit of a caveat here. So with the 1.4 times, I have tested it. It focuses fine. Image quality is decent. So that will get you all the way out to 1120 millimeters, and that's going to be a maximum aperture of f11. Now with the 2 times teleconverter, that'll get you all the way to 1600 millimeters. However, your maximum aperture is going to be f16. Now, you might be able to get away with that if you're shooting with a low resolution body, but both of my Sony cameras are either 50 or 61 megapixels respectively. And so frankly, at f16, diffraction is going to take a hit on pretty much any lens. And so I don't know that I would recommend that. And of course, you're going to need a lot of light to be able to get any kind of reasonable shutter speed when you're shooting at f16. Now, beyond that consideration, what we have here is another beautifully built lens. You know, and frankly, I've used a lot of G Master lenses at this point. And frankly, as I look at this lens and I look at the new 400 to 800 G, I kind of wonder what's the difference between a G and a GM. In this case, obviously, they're reserving the GM label for either the 100 to 400 millimeter, and so that was an early GM model. And beyond that, mostly for the telephotos, the GMs have been reserved more for the Super Tele primes. And so in this case, however, what you've got is what I would call a GM level of build quality. What you do have here is a very professional grade lens. It's made out of a mixture of metals, metal alloys, and engineered plastics, and it feels tough and durable. And frankly, over the last 5 years, that's exactly what this lens has been. It's held up perfectly well during that time. It is a thoroughly weather sealed lens. In this diagram, I count about 21 different gaskets plus a fluorine coating on the front element, obviously a gasket at the lens mount. So we've got thorough weather sealing at all the points throughout the lens itself. And so when you've got a high grade of build, you've got full weather sealing. I don't know what more really you could ask for out of a lens like this, to make it a G Master. And certainly when it comes to the feature set, it is it's got a thorough suite of features here. Most of those come in a bank of switches here. There's kind of two different banks all operating the same or filling the same area on the lens here. And so the top three are an AF MF switch. There's a switch here that will allow you to turn on and off full-time DMF. And so if you have that enabled, no matter what mode you're shooting in and with whatever camera you're shooting in, you can do direct manual override, which can be really useful if you're shooting birds, for example, in branches. And so sometimes a branch might get in the way. And so if you just need to pull focus a little bit, tweak it into the area where it needs to be, that can be very handy. There's also a focus limiter. And so that's going to give you three options. You get the full range. You can shoot from 10 meters down to the minimum focus distance. And that's going to vary, obviously, depending on the focal length. More on that in just a moment. And then you can shoot from 8 meters to infinity. Now, a little bit lower down, you have a couple of OSS related, so optical steady shot, which is the image stabilization system. Two switches related to that, a basic on-off, and then you've got a 3-position switch. And so position 1 being standard, 2 being dedicated for panning, and 3 being a mode that tries to stabilize the viewfinder more. It's probably what I would reach for if you're shooting video as well. Now, I looked very hard and I did not find any kind of actual rating for the OSS system here. As is typically the case with these Sony lenses, if you have a camera that has in-body image stabilization built in, it's not one or the other, but they both work, or neither one of them work. And so if you turn off the OSS switch here, it'll also turn off steady shot inside the camera itself. And so if they're working in concert, let's just say that I doubt that the camera is doing much in terms of stabilization. My experience has been the longer you go with telephoto lenses, particularly on Sony, the less the stabilizer seems to do. And so what I found is that when I was shooting at 800 millimeters at least, I really couldn't get good hand-holdable results until I got down to about 1/60th of a second. So I tried first at 1/8, and then I tried going up to 1/30th, and then I went to 1/60th of a second. It wasn't until 1/60th of a second that I got any kind of repeatable hand-holding results. Obviously, your mileage is going to vary depending on how stable your hands are. Bottom line is that in my test, I found about 4 stops of stabilization at 800 millimeters. And so because there is no rating, if it was better than that, I suspect they would be bragging about it. The fact that they aren't tells me that's probably about the zone that it's actually in. Obviously, it makes a huge difference in a lens this long, and so having stabilization makes a huge difference, and the stabilizer is okay, but it's nothing that's radically good. And frankly, on Sony, it has been kind of rare that I have seen a lens that I think that the stabilization is fantastic. I think maybe Sigma's new optical stabilizer with their Generation 2 algorithm is probably about as good as what I've seen. But anyway, it certainly helps a lot, but don't expect it to be like rock solid if you're trying to track at 800 millimeters. Now, as you can see, this is a big lens, and I'll pop off the hood for a moment because the hood is obviously quite large. But just looking at the raw lens itself, the lens is 11.98 centimeters in diameter. It is 34.6 centimeters in length, and so that breaks down to 4.72 inches by 13.6 inches overall. Obviously, you put that hood in place, it's going to add a significant amount of additional length to it. So to give you an idea idea of comparison here. So here's a shot where you can see them side by side, and obviously here again the hoods make a difference. If I remove the hood, as you can see here, the difference isn't quite as significant. So it's basically, this lens is 9.3 millimeters in diameter wider than the 200-600, and it is a pretty significant 28 millimeters longer than it. It weighs in at right under 2.5 kilograms, 2.47 kilograms. That's right under 5.5 pounds. And so it's a good 300 plus grams heavier than either this lens or a lens like Sigma's 150-600 sport lens. So it's obviously a heavy lens. Also, the front filter diameter has grown from 95 millimeters on the 200-600. It's now 105 millimeters. So unfortunately, you're probably going to have to buy some additional filters if you don't have any that are that big. Now, to help with those filters, the lens hood now has a window in it, and so you can rotate a circular polarizer, for example. It also has a lock, which is not there on the 200-600, but like both, it has that rubberized front surface, which, as you can see, as I'm doing with the 200-600, it makes it for a nice stable place to set that, and so you can help to protect whatever surface you're putting this monstrosity on, and that tends to be the most stable way to put things in place. Now, the tripod foot and collar is somewhat similar in design to what we found on the 200-600. However, this one is easily removable. This one is not really designed to be removed, and so you're going to probably want to keep it in place. Unfortunately, like the 200-600, the 400-800, its tripod foot is not ARCA compatible. So as you can see, I had to add a quick release plate here, and so that I could put it onto a tripod. I don't know why that is, but obviously it is what it is. This knob here will allow you to loosen the tension, and so that you can easily rotate the lens around. And interesting is there is no detents. There's markings on the barrel to line up at kind of the cardinal positions, but there is no detents there to give you a feel for when to adjust it. But obviously you can easily rotate that around. Also in this section, we have got a couple of attachment points on either side, and so you can attach a strap that is included. There's also a nice nylon zipped padded case that comes for it as well in the package. Now, minimum focus distance here is actually a variable minimum focus distance. So on the short end, which is 400 millimeters, on the wide, as we'll call it, the minimum focus distance is 1.7 meters or 5.6 feet. And then that stretches out to 3.6 or 3.5 meters on the telephoto end, or 11.5 feet. Your maximum magnification comes at 400 millimeters, and it's a decent 0.23 times. And as you can see here, you can fill the frame fairly well with an object like that. And frankly, even though the working distance is much longer at 800 millimeters, 800 millimeters is a really long focal length, and you can actually get fairly close to that magnification on the telephoto end as well. But you'll get a little bit better results if you work on the wide end instead. Obviously, we also have two rings here. The manual focus ring, I think, has actually a nice level of damping. I liked the precision of it. And of course, the best thing about these designs is that most of the competing third-party lenses have an externally zooming lens. And so even if they have a smooth zoom action, it's a lot more work, a lot more rotation, so you can't be as reactive in the field. These lenses are amazing. You can go just that easy from the whole extreme. And so what I find is it's very easy to quickly acquire at 400 millimeters, snap up to 800 millimeters if you want a tight framing, or anything in between. The balance stays the same. So these lenses, they're more difficult to transport, but what I love about them is that when you're actually in the field, the handling is so beautiful in these lenses. It allows you to be much more reactive than with any kind of externally zooming lens. So I love that. We've also got custom or function buttons, focus hold buttons in 3 different positions, and so bottom, left side, and top side. And there's a Sony logo that's over on this side. But what that allows you to do is that whatever your shooting position is, you're going to be able to quickly have a custom or function button that's easily accessible to hand there. Now, I did note that when it comes to the balance of the lens, again, because you have to introduce an extra variable in this quick release plate, obviously you're going to want to go for as stable a plate as possible. But what I found is, in comparing these two lenses, I actually found that the balance point is better in the 200 to 600 millimeter. I mostly shot handheld, believe it or not, when shooting this lens for my real world use, but for doing all of my chart tests, obviously I'm doing them on a tripod and trying to be as steady and stable as possible. So that takes a lot of work to frame the test chart properly, and what I found is that I could easily do it because of a great balance with the 200 to 600. With the 400 to 800, I felt like the balance wasn't as good, so what I tended to have to do was overcompensate with it a little high to begin with, because once I allowed that weight to fully settle down, it was going to settle downward just a little bit on my tripod, and so I had to adjust the framing accordingly. So overall, however, this is another beautifully made lens. It handles great. Yes, it's going to be heavy. It's certainly not impossible to hand hold it, but you have to be accustomed to hand holding heavier lenses. Sometimes it can be handy if that's kind of in your way to just rotate that up out of the way, and so you're holding it like this. But I found that it's certainly possible to use it out in the field this way, but obviously if you're shooting for extended times, extended durations, you may find that you get fatigued in carrying this. Let's just say that this is kind of like a weightlifting. You're going to have to put in some reps before you get accustomed to carrying this kind of weight. It is possible to do it, but many people are going to find it more comfortable to work either off of a tripod or off of a monopod in using it. So let's talk about autofocus. Obviously, autofocus has updated a little bit. It's a similar design to what we see in the 200-600, but they have updated to their more recent XD linear motors. We have nice big XD linear motors in this particular model, and so what it allows it to do is to have quick focus transitions, and even when you're doing causing big focus changes like what I'm doing in my test, you can see at 400 millimeters it's really quick, and then at 800 millimeters it's just a tiny bit more deliberate, but really for shooting at 800 millimeters, that's impressively fast. And what I found out in the real world is that this lens is very nicely reactive. Now, I have tested autofocus on the Alpha 1, so I was shooting up to 30 frames per second, but this lens is designed for use also with the A9 Mark III, which would allow you to keep up with 120 frames per second. They also say that tracking will keep live while zooming in and out, and so obviously that's going to be useful as well. I did shoot this sequence, for example, with 138 frames as I was out, and there was hundreds of geese out on this ice floe, but most of them were just staying still. And I saw a goose take off out of the peripheral. I turned and I snapped focus, and it picked it up from the very first frame, and you can see that the focus was perfect all throughout that frame, which is fantastic. And so, I mean, you have the right kind of light in the right situation. Focus changes are it's fantastic at tracking. I said with the right amount of light. The problem is with a lens that has this small of a maximum aperture, it means that you really do need adequate light. So there's going to be certain applications that work and certain applications that don't. I did testing in a fairly brightly lit field house of a runner moving at a moderate pace there. And so what I found, however, even in setting up the shot in that lighting, though it wasn't bad, and frankly, I shot on the 400 millimeter, and so I could get the widest possible maximum aperture of this f6.3. What I found is I was still shooting at ISO 6400, and even then only getting shutter speeds like 1/200th of a second, which frankly isn't enough to really stop action. And so what you can see in these sequences is that while focus is keeping up, things don't look all that sharp because a majority of the frames have some degree of motion blur that are affecting them. And so obviously that's going to be a significant issue. And that was, I could boost things on up to 12,800, but even then I'm only going to be increasing shutter speed so much and only stopping action so much. So that obviously is going to be a huge consideration. You're going to need lots of light with this lens. And so, frankly, this is a lens to be used in daylight outdoor conditions. Either that or you're going to have to be under extremely bright lights if it's some kind of sporting event. This is the reason why people pay the big bucks for the big super telephoto primes, because they do manage to give you a long focal length with a fast maximum aperture or faster maximum aperture. This is just kind of slow for those applications. So it's not really an autofocus problem, it's a light gathering problem. Autofocus seems to be fantastic. How about on the video side of things? Frankly, I didn't have high expectations, and so my expectations were actually more than met when I tested for that. Now, obviously, I have to change all of my test paradigms when testing for something this long. It's frankly a pain because it's just so long that it doesn't fit in any of my spaces. You know, for example, when I was shooting my test chart, this is how far away I had to be. I had to set up everything outside. I had to shovel some snow to even get to a place where I could, work the range of the zoom. And so it was a pain. However, what I found is that I was actually very pleasantly surprised by how nicely damp focus pools were, going back and forth between subjects. And what you can see here is that focus breathing is actually really low. And yes, I did have focus breathing compensation turned off for this test. And what I found is that as I put these side by side, you can see that the size of the object changes almost not at all, whether or not it's in or out of focus. And so that was really, really great. I had to do kind of a weird hand test, instead of about the 6 foot distance that I usually work, I was like 40 feet away. But even though the compression means that there's not much distance between my hand and my face, it felt like it did okay in that, and that it transitioned just fine from one subject to the other. I also took some videos where I was tracking turkeys walking around in the early morning light in my backyard. I did see one moment in one of the clips where focus drifted onto a foreground bush that was there, but for the most part, everything seemed to track just fine. So obviously, video is going to be work as well, trying to track and keep the subject in the frame. But autofocus seems to be doing a good job. And so as far as the actual focus, I give it very good results for that, particularly for being such an extreme focal length and zoom range. So how about the image quality? I'm going to give you the overview here, and then those of you that want the deeper dive, that will come at the end of the video. This is a hugely complex lens, 27 elements in 19 groups. I think it ties with the Sigma 60-600 DN Sport lens as the most complex lenses that I have ever tested in terms of their optical designs. So there's a lot of elements. 6 of those are extra low dispersion elements. You can see from the MTF chart that it looks really quite good, and it's very sharp in the center of the frame, and 400mm end, it kind of slowly drifts towards the edge. On the 800mm end, there's quite a difference between the two axes, and so one drops while the other stays pretty flat. Now what's interesting here is that Sony's MTFs show wide open and they show f8. So you may have picked up at the 800mm end, because the maximum aperture is f8, it shows f8 twice there. And so if it doesn't look like it gets any better when it stops down, that's because there is no stop down between wide open and f8 in this particular case. Now, what I found when I began to test other things is that I found that there is a minimal amount of fringing in that sequence where I was shooting the runner in the field house. I saw a little bit of green fringing in an open door where there was a really bright transition area, but it was just really, really minor. And in these other shots with the geese out on the ice, lots of opportunities there for fringing, and frankly, I really didn't see any. And so I think overall that's not going to be an issue. I also didn't really see any kind of issue with lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. As I looked testing for vignette and distortion, what I found on the distortion front is that it's all pincushion distortion to varying degrees. And I actually found that it kind of fluctuated a little bit up and down as I moved forward. And so, starting at 400mm, I saw about a -4 to correct. And so a minor amount of pincushion distortion. It fluctuated as high as a -6. And then it was as little at the 800mm and as a -3. What I also found is that vignette was consistently very, very low, surprisingly low throughout that zoom range, only about a stop maximum at any given point. And you can see at this shot, for example, this is around 700mm, wide open, no correction. And you can see that even though we've got nothing but snow in the lower right corner of this image, you'll see no vignette there, and that's with 0 correction. So I think that is pretty fantastic. It is very good at keeping an even illumination all across the frame. So how about the sharpness of the image? I did a multiple test here to try to collate the results, make sure I got as consistent as possible, because again, there's a lot of extra variables when you're shooting with something that's this long. And what I found is that at 400mm, the results are fairly good, good sharpness across the frame. Contrast is okay, but not amazing in my experience in my test. However, again, as I looked at that and I said, well, that's good, but I think I feel like I've seen better. So I went to compare with the 200-600mm, a lens that I have found in a lot of comparisons is as good or better than any of the competition that I've tested it against. And what I found is that 400mm, I found this to be just a little bit sharper. And so, that's great if it's taking something that I already considered to be kind of the standard bearer and it's even a hair better than that. That's obviously great. What I found also is that when I stopped it down, there is a minor improvement, a little bit more contrast, but nothing significant. And so probably not much you're really going to pick up on without looking at it at extreme levels of magnification. Now, when I stop the lens on down, remember that minimum aperture here on the wide end is f/36. You're going to want to avoid that because diffraction, particularly on a high resolution body, is going to really hammer image quality, and you can see it's a lot softer at f/36 than it was at f/11. Moving on in the zoom range, I found at 500mm that it probably achieved peak sharpness. It was definitely sharper, better contrast, and that was consistent across the frame. I was very impressed at those results, and so that's a great focal length. If you're shooting at 500mm, you're going to probably get the best results out of the lens. Moving on to 600mm, I found that the results were not quite as good as at 500mm. And again, when I went back to test with the 200-600mm, I felt like at 600mm, I did slightly favor the results from the 200-600mm, but again, that's at high levels of magnification with them side by side. Moving on to 7 and then 800mm, I found at 800mm that results were good, but contrast is a little bit lower. But what's interesting is that even if you stop down just that 1/3 stop from f8 to f9, it's actually surprising how much contrast improves. And you can see it here in this chart test. So I thought, well, is that going to be true in a real world result? And so I shot another series of comparisons, and you can see here anywhere where I look at it, that there's definitely more contrast at f9 than what there is at f8. And so that's a little bit of a pro tip there. If you're shooting with this lens, 1/3 less stop of light is not going to make a significant difference, but the improvement in image quality is probably worth doing it. Now, what's interesting is that if I put the 1.4 times on the 200-600, I can get up to 840mm at f9 on the Telephoto M. So if I compare 840mm in that combo to 800mm here, both of them at f9, you can see that the 400-800mm is definitely better. And so if you're looking to have good image quality at 800mm, then this is the way to go. The overall rendering, I feel like this lens is optimized to try to get as much sharpness as possible out of it. The bokeh is okay. I find that it can be a little bit busy with these kinds of focal lengths. It seems like, at least, in the time I'm shooting right now is the ugly season of the year. So there's a lot of just bare stuff in the background. I found that the bokeh looked a little bit busy to my eye in a number of different shots. A lot of stuff's going to be in the transition zone, particularly if you're shooting at a, kind of a distant subject, and then the background it's not a great ratio. Now, if you get close to a subject, you can obviously completely blur out a background, and of course the bokeh is going to look fine there. But I would say that if you want amazing bokeh at long focal lengths, you probably need to pay for one of the higher end prime lenses, or haven't tested it yet, maybe a lens like the new Sigma 300-500mm f4, a lens like that might give you a little bit more blurred out backgrounds. I also found, though I didn't really point it into the sun a whole lot, that the flare resistance is good overall. This is obviously can get you to a very narrow angle of view, and so perhaps the need to shoot right into the sun is going to be pretty rare, but Sony's coatings are great and flare resistance is good. So my conclusion is this. I recognize that for most photographers, this lens is going to be somewhat of a novelty. We like looking at lenses like this, but most people, they're just not interested in carrying something this big and this heavy around. And obviously it's also going to be at $2,800 US. It's going to be somewhat prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. And so they're probably going to be content with one of the $1,200 to $1,500 lenses from Tamron or Sigma that aren't as extreme as this, but much more affordable and maybe a little bit smaller and easier to carry around. But for a certain niche of photographer, this is going to be a game-changing kind of lens because all of a sudden it opens up completely new horizons in terms of overall length. This is the first Sony zoom to reach 800 millimeters, and as we've just seen, it does so quite competently. And while $2,800 sounds expensive if you're accustomed to looking at lenses, below $1,000 or, from $1,000 to $1,500, the truth of the matter is that this lens is $10,000 cheaper than the primes that are the closest to getting to this kind of focal length. And so in that sense, it's quite a good value. It really all depends on your perspective. I will also note that lenses like this have a steeper learning curve than more accessible lenses. You have to learn how to use them right. You have to learn the conditions where they actually work. You have to be a little more intentional about making sure you have the right lighting conditions. And so yes, they do involve some work. However, this is a lens that's going to enable you to get photos that maybe you were unable to get before. It's got fast autofocus, it's got good optics, it handles great, it's heavy, but it handles great. And so this may be the lens that you have been waiting for. And if you want even more information about it, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. And there is also buying links in the description if you would like to purchase one for yourself or get a pre-order in right now. And of course, if you want an even deeper dive into the optical performance, stay tuned. We're going to jump into it together right now.
Okay, let's start by taking a look at the different framing options available. So we've got 400 millimeters, we have 800 millimeters. If we take a look here at 400 millimeters in the center of the frame here with a still static subject, you can see detail looks really, really great. And as we pan over, we can see that it's pretty consistent right off to the edge of the frame. If we look over here on the right side, we can see that contrast isn't as strong, in my opinion, if we look at the 800 millimeter end, but it looks pretty decent. You can see that the corners look a little bit softer relative to what we see at 400 millimeter end. Now, for the sake of bringing all my charts outside, I took just the one chart, and so we can see that there is some pincushion distortion at 400 millimeters, fairly mild, and you can see here in my correction on the right side, I used a -4 to correct for the pincushion distortion. You can see nice straight lines all around, no problem there, and vignette is really quite minimal. This is about a +31 to correct for. As I went throughout the zoom range, I found that there was a little bit of a seesaw up and down in terms of the quantity of the pincushion distortion. The most I saw was about -6, and so all relatively mild, and the actual amount of vignette was just consistently really quite low. At 800 millimeters, I saw even a hair less of the pincushion distortion. This is only a -3 to correct for, so, kind of 1 percentage point less. Vignette is incredibly low. As you can see, it really doesn't look all that much difference. I've added a little bit, about a +29 to correct for vignette, but it stays really, really mild. And so you can see it's really quite evenly illuminated across the frame. This is probably the worst example that I saw at any point of any kind of fringing. You can see we've got a really bright, high contrast and open door. And so, the light coming through, there's just that tiny bit of fringing there. But again, this is the worst that I saw at any point, so nothing to be concerned about. Here we can see that lateral style chromatic aberrations are really just not a problem. There's nothing showing up in terms of the transition here from black to white. Now here is the test chart, and so we're going to be looking at 200% magnification, 61 megapixels, and so in the middle of the frame at 400 millimeters, you can see as we saw in the real world shot, it really looks quite good, pretty good contrast and detail, and as we move over here towards the mid frame, again, still looking quite good, and as we pan on down towards the corner, we can see that really the corners look quite good, and so a really consistent performance across the frame. If we put that into perspective with the 200 to 600 millimeters here at 400, we can see that, there's a little bit of give and take there. I would say just a little bit more detail on the 400 to 800 millimeter. Contrast is arguably a hair better on the 200 to 600. We look at this zone, however, there's no question that the 400 to 800 is resolving better. I mean, that detail looks great. You can see it's a little bit more blurry looking. Even though contrast contrast looks quite good. Down here into the corner, and again, you can see that the amount of information that is resolved is just a little bit better than what we're seeing on the 200 to 600. If we pop up and look in this zone, it's kind of a wash to me. They look roughly similar up into this corner. And I think maybe the 200 to 600 looks a little bit better up in this corner. Stopping down to F8, you can see does give us a contrast boost, that the blacks look a little bit darker here. I would say that things are resolving just a little bit better. We look back here into the mid frame, and you can see that it's not super pronounced, but definitely some improvement there. We look up into this corner, and I would say, yes, I'm seeing a little bit of improvement there as well. F11 is the last place you can go before diffraction really starts to affect things, and you can see that here at F36, diffraction has just demolished the image quality, and so I would avoid shooting at anything. F16 would be the absolute last I would go, but anything beyond that I would completely avoid on a high resolution body. Now, by 500 millimeters, I think we hit what I consider the peak performance for this lens. You can see that the contrast is noticeably higher at 500 millimeters versus 400 millimeter zone. If we look here in the mid frame, really quite obvious. I mean, it looks really gorgeous. Great detail, great contrast. Up here into this upper left corner again, and you can see just a really noticeable difference there. Look at this zone here versus here. Pretty remarkable difference. Now, maximum aperture is f7.1 at 500 millimeters. By 600 millimeters, it is now f8, where it's going to stay throughout the rest of the zoom range. We can see that there's a pretty obvious decline in terms of overall resolution. Just mostly it's the contrast, just doesn't look quite as good. Looking at this zone, you can see what I'm talking about. There's still, I mean, there's lots of things being resolved there. You can just see that the contrast doesn't look as good there. So there's just kind of a little bit of haze over the textures. If I bring the 200 to 600 millimeter back in here at 600 millimeters, we can see that it's got the edge at 600 millimeters. You can just see the contrast is better. Even its ability to resolve is improved there. Going up into the mid frame, we can see that it's maybe not as pronounced here, but definitely still better overall. We'll take a look in this upper left corner, and we can see that it's pretty similar there down in the lower right corner. I would say that the 400 to 800 has a very slight edge. If we pop over into this zone, looking roughly similar. Over on this side, again, more similar than different. At 700 millimeters, we can see a fairly similar performance to 600 millimeters, looking good, but not necessarily great. It's resolving a lot of information, but contrast doesn't jump off the page. Corners are looking pretty decent, however, and so it's holding up on its image quality fairly well. Here's some quick real-world perspective near 700 millimeters with a fairly still subject. I mean, I think that's a pretty great amount of information that's being resolved there, so I don't think I have much of a complaint about that. So finally, near 800 millimeters, it's very similar to what we saw at 700 millimeters in that detail is good, contrast is just okay. Now this actually looks quite good here in the mid frame and down into the corner. Corners are holding up fairly well, so overall a pretty good performance, just contrast isn't mind-blowing. As noted, however, even at 200% magnification, if you'll stop down even just that 1/3 stop to f9, you can see that it really makes a difference in improving that contrast. It actually improves really quite quickly, and so everything looks a little bit deeper. If we look in some of these zones, you can just see that more of the textures pop on here on the right side, and that's due to just improved contrast. So it's definitely worth that little bit of stop down at f9 if you want that extra bit of pop of resolution. If we compare the 800 millimeters at f9 of the 400 to 800 versus the 200 to 600 with the 1.4 times, that gets us up to 840 millimeters. You can see you're definitely going to get a better result at 800 millimeters on the 400 to 800. And so pretty obvious difference in the middle. In the mid frame, you can see still that it's just a better contrast, better detail, better performance there down into the corners. Pretty obvious win there and up into this corner as well. You can see a nice amount of centering and just an overall better performance versus the teleconverter combination. And how about if we throw on the teleconverter? And so here on the wide end, it becomes 560 millimeters and f9. On the telephoto end with the 1.4 times, it becomes 1120 millimeters at f11. And so we can see, looking in at both of these, obviously you're going to get higher performance on the wide end. It's for a variety of reasons, but you can see that it's certainly still a usable amount of image quality here, even at 1120 millimeters, just not incredibly sharp. But I think that if you did a little bit of work with that, if this is high resolution. If you scale that down a little bit, I think it would probably look just fine. Now here's the look at the maximum magnification on the 400 millimeter end. And again, I think that the result holds up pretty well here. Pretty good detail and contrast. Looks good there. This is an example of what you can do in catching something in flight here. And this is probably one of my favorite images out of my review period with this. You can see the detail looks great there and a great looking image. Since we've already looked at flare resistance, let's just end this off by taking a look at the rendering and bokeh quality. So as mentioned, if you get really close to a subject, as we've got here, you can strongly blur out the background and the bokeh is great. Image like this, however, with some complicated layers, I just find that looks a little bit busy to my eye. I also don't love these kind of elements with the bright kind of specular highlights there. And so that isn't fantastic. This to my eye looks kind of busy. And so, it's not a great ratio of my distance to my subject and then the distance to the background. Here's a kind of a more moderate result where my distance to the subject isn't too bad and then the distance to the background. There's still some stuff in the transition zone, but we'll call this the neutral shot. And I think it looks okay. So in other words, you're just going to have to be selective about your backgrounds and what you put in the frame.
Thanks for sticking around to the very end. I hope that the deep dive into the optics has helped you to understand whether or not this is the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.